Mm, Dear colleagues, it's time to open our final session and to introduce our first invited speaker, Professor Mark Baker. Mark, are you muted or are you online? Can you hear us? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm delighted to introduce Mark Baker as our first invited speaker. He is a distinguished professor and professor of linguistics and cognitive sciences at Rutgers University. He's justly famous for his monographs and numerous papers in linguistic typology and language theory, and his contributions both to language theory and to the descriptions of numerous world's languages. So he's one of his main pivots of interest, so to say, is syntax of natural languages and also parameterizing of language diversity, which accidentally is also the main theme of our conference. So, Mark, we are in front of very exciting talk, and Mark was so kind that he allowed us to post his extended presentation, which is available on the conference website. But now we'll try whether Mark can display everything he needs for this talk, please.
Mm-hmm. All right, do you see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
Yeah. All right, the three of you on my screen at the moment see my PowerPoint presentation, so that's good. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I was happy to see the invitation. That the goals of your conference seem very much like the goals of my career. Happy to meet with you and spend a couple of half days with you. I was going to say I'm glad to be here with you for part of your conference. I realize here has definitely shifted its semantic meaning in this sentence, but hopefully with has not shifted its semantic meaning so much. And you know, it's nice to have these. I even have a little photo of Red Square behind this, so that to give me a little feeling like I'm in Moscow without the jet lag. So the topic that I'm going to focus on today, as a launching point anyway, is logophoric pronouns in African languages, universals and variation, and some larger comparisons. But first, just a general remark about what I've learned, I think, from 30, 35 years of studying linguistic diversity and counting, is that it has a certain fractal quality to it. These issues of universals and variation. And by fractal quality, I mean that the key issues can arise at many layers of granularity, but they look pretty much the same at all those layers. You can study variation in the language of a single speaker, diglossia, or optionality. You can study variation across idiolects or unrecognizable dialects, people who think they're part of the same dialect, but they speak systematically differently in some respect. You can study variation across recognizable dialects, the ones that sociolinguists know about, differences in, from region or class or something like that. You can study variation across closely related languages, say the different Slavic languages compared one to another. You can study variation across distantly related languages, say Russian and Hindi and French and English. Or you can study variation or lack thereof across even unrelated languages. Now, at this point, the fact that there's variation there is not maybe the surprise. Now the surprise is the fact that there's universals. Sometimes there's lack of variation there. And to my mind, conceptually and practically, the issues raised by these patterns of variation and universality are pretty similar at each level. This has led to some controversies. So some researchers have advocated for a micro-comparative approach, saying the most principled, most feasible way to study this is to look at the closely related languages or the closely related dialects, because then you have natural controls. They're not going to be wildly different. And the conjecture is you can learn everything you need to know about language from those comparisons. Maybe the little differences always add up to big differences. In contrast to that, I've been some advocate for studying macro-comparative, that there is some value in both feasibility and value to studying variation and the lack of it even across unrelated languages. There's enough universal grammar, there's enough constraints on the language system that you don't get crazy variation to make this infeasible to do, and there are some distinctive things that you might learn by doing it. So I say that because that's not what I'm going to do in this talk, or more properly, it's only what I'm going to do for part of this talk. So in this talk, I'm going to do two phases. The heart of today's talk will be to look at some variation across closely related languages of West Africa that share this property of logophoric pronouns that I'm about to tell you about. But then the last phase of the talk, the last 15 minutes or so, I'll also look at a larger scale comparison where I'll compare logophoric pronouns in these West African languages with indexical shift, as I've been able to study it in certain languages of Asia. And there we'll find variation, yes, but also lack thereof across unrelated languages. So that's kind of the context and the goals for what I'll talk about today. Let me start to get into it then properly. What's a logophoric pronoun? Some of you probably know this, some of you may not. This is the fact that some languages have a special pronoun that's used inside complement clauses to refer to the matrix subject. Scare quotes on that. We'll come back to what that really is a little bit later. Here are some examples of this from the Ibibio language of Nigeria. If you want to say, Okon told his mother the news, you have a pronoun. That's got to be the ordinary pronoun here, his. You can't have this special logophoric pronoun. The situation changes when you have an embedded clause under the verb tell. Now, if you want a pronoun that refers to the subject of the matrix clause, Okon told Edem that MM doesn't like him, meaning Okon. Now you do use this special logophoric form. Wasn't possible in the matrix sentence, but it is possible in the embedded sentence. But it's possible in the embedded sentence with a limited usage. It's possible only to refer to the matrix subject. If you want to refer to the matrix object, then you use the plain pronoun again. Special pronoun used in embedded clauses to refer to the matrix subject. Here's another example from Edo, another language in Nigeria. You use the plain pronoun, and that doesn't refer to the matrix subject. You use the special pronoun that does refer to the main subject. Edo's just added, like in BBO, if you use it in the direct object position of a simple sentence, that's not possible. There's a little qualification here. You can use that in focus position, but not in the in situ position. So sometimes these special pronouns have other uses as focus pronouns or so on. So I don't have the narrowest possible definition of a logophoric pronoun where it's only used in embedded clauses. But still, I think it's clear that there's something special going on here. Two other things that I'm not talking about, or not talking about yet anyway. Some languages, the logophoric pronoun topic is comparable but distinct from the topic of indexical shift. So here's an example from an Indo-Aryan languages that I've worked on, the language Magi. Here also you can use a special pronoun in embedded clauses. So the clause is Santi told Banti that I saw Ram. Well, I gave it away already. But here's a special pronoun. It's used inside the embedded clause. It can refer to the matrix subject, but not the matrix object. That's like the logophoric pronoun that I showed you from Abibio and Edo. But this one can be used in the matrix clause, just in a slightly surprising way, to refer to the speaker. It's a normal first-person pronoun, but then it undergoes indexical shift, as it's called, inside the embedded clauses. This is what I'm not talking about yet, but in the last phase of my talk, I will make a comparison between these two phenomena. Another comparable phenomena is the use of long-distance reflexives in some languages, like Korean. When these long-distance reflexives are used in embedded clauses, they have the kind of similar properties, behavior that we have in these, that we saw in Abibio. So you use self in the embedded clause in Korean, and that can refer to the matrix subject, but not the matrix object. Special form of the pronoun in an embedded clause to refer to the matrix subject, but not the matrix object. That's like the logophoric phenomenon. This is often called a logophoric use of long-distance reflexives, but they're not logophoric pronouns in the strict sense, because they can also be used in the matrix clause, unlike the special pronouns in Abibio. When they're used in the matrix clauses, they're simple reflexive pronouns, like Tom criticized himself here. Here again, it's not the same phenomenon as logophoric pronouns. We could compare them. I won't do that in this talk. Rather, I will do that next week when I go to Korea, and then focus on this comparison. According to my definition of logophoric pronouns, it's a relatively narrow phenomenon, maybe a very narrow phenomenon, aerial in West Africa. Maybe exists in one or two places else in the world, but it's kind of striking how limited it is. Therefore, I have to do comparison of related languages when I'm doing this, because these are the only ones that they're where that's used. So that's defining my topic, characterizing my topic, what this talk is about. Let me now put out for you here my analytical framework. And I don't know how weird this will be, but so we're looking at a special pronoun inside an embedded clause that can refer to the matrix subject. But I'm taking a tradition now from about 30 years ago now of saying there is actually another component in the analysis here. There's some kind of invisible noun phrase, which I'm going to call op for operator, that's here inside the specifier of the CP position, roughly. And that mediates the relationship between the matrix subject and the embedded logophoric pronoun. So this needs to be there. And we actually have two relationships here. The matrix subject controls this operator, and this operator binds the special logophoric pronoun. That's a framework for this seminal paper that I'm going to take forward. Those of you who are paying attention to Irina Burukina's talk, if you saw something like this, her talk was claiming that something like this is actually realized as a dative noun phrase in Mari, and then it came up in the right or not. I'm a writer. I'm showing you what I can do with that. But I'm not just asserting it's right for no reason. Here are a couple of initial motivations for taking this kind of approach. There are two reasons to think that what's happening around this complementizer node is a crucial ingredient to logophoric construction. Number one is just this fact that it matters whether the pronoun is above the complementizer or below the complementizer. If it's outside the embedded clause, then you need to use a plain pronoun to refer to the subject. You can't use the logophoric pronoun. If it's under the embedded complementizer, inside the embedded clause, then the judgment's reverse. You have to use the special pronoun, whether you can use the plain pronoun. That varies some from language to language in a way that I'll come back to. So that makes sense if the logophoric pronoun has to be initially dependent on this operator. If it's below the operator, that's possible. If it's higher than the operator, it's not possible. You can't be directly dependent on the matrix subject only via that operator. That's my first initial motivation for this. My second initial motivation for this is the simple fact that it depends what the complementizer is in these kind of constructions. This is a BBO data, again, from a Nigerian language I've worked on quite a bit. In the examples where you have a logophoric pronoun in the embedded clause, you have this in ordinary, indicative, finite complementizer K. But if you, instead of saying Ocon is ashamed that he stole a book, you say Ocon is ashamed because he stole the book. That versus because aren't very different in this kind of context. But when you have this complementizer, then the logophoric pronoun isn't possible. Similarly, Ocon doesn't see that his mother is guilty. With the that complementizer, the logophoric pronoun is a fine way to refer to the matrix subject. But with a how complementizer, Ocon saw MM stealing his goat. It isn't. So this is, again, reason to say, well, it matters what's here, and what's here is in a selectional relationship to what's here. Some complementizers have this component, which is a crucial part of the logophoric construction. Some complementizers don't. You may want to challenge me about that a little bit in the discussion period or so on. It's an abstract analysis to the degree that it's dependent on this covert piece of structure. Now, from this perspective, and there's three subtopics that we could typologize or defend or talk about. One is this matter that I just talked about a little bit. Where can you have this operator? What's the conditions on this being present in the first place? Second, what kinds of things can control that operator? I've assumed that it's the subject of a speech verb so far, but what are the limits? What are the exact parameters on that? And then the third part is, well, what about this relationship? What constraints might there be on the operator and the pronoun down here? Are there restrictions on what I'm calling a binding relationship here? To keep, so that I don't talk to you all day, I will just make a quick remark or two about number 1 and number 2 here. That was mostly introduced for comparative purposes when I come to indexical shift at the end. And then the part for logophorics pronouns that I'll talk about in the most detail is this number 3, because I think this is the one where we see the most intricate pattern of universals and variation. And you tell me you're interested in universals and variation. So I'll show you what I think's going on there. But first, a brief word about the first two parts. Where can the operator occur and what kind of phrases? Well, the rough answer that I've already alluded to is that they can be in finite CPs, especially with a verbal kind of complementizer. So we've seen already in a BBO, they happen in K complements. And K complements have finite verbs, declarative meanings, etc. That's their home base. That's where they're always possible. At the other extreme, where they're never possible, is they're not possible in nominalizations, which have noun-like syntax. So instead of saying, Ocon does not see that his mother did something wrong, embedded complement, embedded CP, embedded clause, here we say, Ocon did not see his mother's fault, nominalized version of the verb. So it has a nominal prefix, and this is also the syntax of a possessor. So subjects come before the verb in a BBO, but possessors come after the nominalization. This is syntactically like the possessor of the nominal. Well, in this case, the logophoric pronoun isn't possible to refer to the person who's seeing. Only the plain pronoun is possible. So we've got this range: full finite CPs with a verbal C allow it. Nominal constructions with a noun-like syntax do not allow it. In between these, there's a variety of other possibilities: CPs with a nominal C, infinitives, gerunds, etc., things that are somewhere in the continuum between a full finite CP and a noun phrase. And there's some good room to do typology there, but I won't do that, partly because I don't have enough data about this from languages other than a BBO. Second part of the framework, this is the question of what can control the operator. What are the restrictions on this? Ultimately, then, what can be the antecedent of the logophoric pronoun? And my rough two-slide answer to that is thematic subjects can be. And here, this is consciously a blend of syntax and semantics talk. Subjects, it matters what's in the subject position syntactically, but it also matters the thematic roles. This slide illustrates the thematic roles, that the controller needs to be an agent, a source, or experiencer. I assume that's some kind of natural class of thematic roles. So I've shown you examples with tell so far. Here's a similar example with ask. asked Ocon if Adam saw logophore. Here the logophore is possible with the matrix subject, i.e. the agent, the asker, the source of the question. It's not possible with the object, the goal, the receiver of the question, parallel to what we've seen so far. But with here, it turns out to be different. If you say Ocon heard from that Edem doesn't like him, this one's actually ambiguous in a BBO. Refer to the matrix subject as before, but so here to the source phrase. So here theta role matters. This has a subject-like theta role of being a source. This does not. That means this can be the antecedent for a logophoric pronoun in a way that this can't. I'd say this is a kind of subject, but a semantic sense of subject. Then here's the other side of it to prove to you that it's not just thematic, but grammatical subjecthood is a factor here as well. Here we can compare remember to remind. In a BBO, these are the same verb. Used intransitively, it means remember. Used transitively, it means remind. When you use it intransitively, Ocon remembered that logophore should buy rice. Then the rememberer, the subject, is the possible antecedent for the logophore. It means Ocon remembered that he should buy rice. But now when we do remind, the children reminded Ocon that he or they should buy rice. Now the logophoric pronoun cannot refer to Ocon, it can only refer to the children. Why not? Here Ocon is remembering, here Ocon is remembering. I assume the theta roles are the same here, but the theta role is not by itself enough to guarantee you can be the antecedent of the logophoric pronoun. Rather, it matters what the subject is. If there's a better subject, a better antecedent here, that's subject and has the right kind of theta role, that grabs the reference of this. So that's the rough story that I have on the control of the operators here. And so far, I have little clear evidence of variation on this point. I've got lots of data on a BBO. I've got a fair amount about Yorba. I've got some on Anyway from the literature. And I think this characterization works across that whole range of languages. But of course, that's not a very, very extensive range yet. All right, that brings me to the part that will be my most detailed discussion of this kind of cross-linguistic variation, comparing within these related West African languages. And that's the question of what are the restrictions on the operator binding the logophoric pronoun, that last part of it. And the first impression that I got, I think the literature has, is there are almost no restrictions. The logophoric pronoun can be in any position in the embedded clause. It can be the subject, it can be the object, it can be the possessor of the object, it can be inside a prepositional phrase. No restrictions on where it is in the embedded clause. It can be deeper inside a further embedded clause. Ocon thinks that Edem told me that phone respects logophore. Well, this one in the doubly embedded clause can still be refer to this thing at the top of the sentence. And even in a more complex construction like this with a relative clause, which behaves like a syntactic island, blocking off different kinds of grammatical relationships, it doesn't block off this grammatical relationship. Ocon thinks that Edem is looking for a woman who will marry him. The logophoric pronoun down here inside the relative clause can still refer to the matrix subject there. So seems like no restrictions. But there is one restriction that I know of in a very sort of particular kind of environment. That's that there's some restrictions that appear when one tries to have two different pronouns inside a clause referring to the same antecedent. So suppose we want to say Ocon thinks that his son insulted him. Ocon thinks that Ocon's son insulted Ocon. How can you say that in these West African languages? Well, the obvious possibility is we could have two logophoric pronouns here. Ocon thinks that Logophore's son insulted Logophore. That's always possible. And that's straightforward, always possible. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. The more subtle one that where we have some typologizing worth doing is suppose you try to use one plain pronoun and one logophoric pronoun with the same kind of meaning, two different kinds of pronouns referring to the same antecedent. And the interesting thing is that this is sometimes possible, sometimes not. It depends on the syntactic configuration, and it depends on the language. So in this case, it's possible, just a little bit of marginality because the double logophore example is more straightforward, it's less ambiguous. So this is a slightly less preferred, but basically possible. In contrast, if you try to do the same thing here, Ocon thinks that he insulted his mother, plain pronoun in the subject position, logophoric pronoun as the possessor of the object. This is totally out on the meaning of both of these pronouns referring to Ocon. So there's a clear difference between it being possible here, impossible here, depending on the structure. Here I give a brief primer review of the idea of C-command. C-command is a prominent idea in the kind of generative linguistics that I do. I was listening to see if anybody mentioned C-command and everybody smiled and nodded at the earlier talks today. It sounds like some of you probably know about C-command, but I'm not going to assume that all of you do. This is a definition defined over the phrase structure of sentences that's thought to be very important for how pronouns work in many languages. For example, in English with each other, you can say the children saw each other's mothers, and that's fine. But you can't say the children's mothers saw each other, where each other refers to the children. You can't say each other's mothers saw the children. You can't say each other saw the children's mother. Generative linguists have over 35 years defined a program that each other must, the antecedent of each other must C-command it. And I'm not going to give anybody a quiz on C-command here, just try the idea that you could understand this if you tried, and that there is some basis to what I'm saying. And then if you just get a flavor for this and then trust me in the examples, you can come back and look at these slides later if you want to try to double check me. But the idea is the first C-command is the first category that contains the antecedent, also contains the anaphor. So here the antecedent in all these examples that I gave you is children. The first category above it is the yellow one that's defined for C-command. And then you look whether the yellow category contains the each other. Here it does, and that's the possible one. Here it doesn't, That one's impossible. Here it doesn't. Oh, that should be, no, that's right. Sorry. That doesn't. So it's a structural condition that allows you to talk about in a precise way where the antecedent of each other has to be relative to the each other itself. And there are some other ways of doing this too. There are other kind of definitions that are more or less equivalent. We could talk about alternatives later if you wanted to. Here's why I have bothered to tell you this. This predicate helps us to sort out when the mixed pronouns are possible or not possible in, say, a BBO. Turns out that if neither pronoun C commands the other, the mixed pronouns are possible. They're bad if one of the pronouns C commands the other. So here are 4 BBO sentences that systematically vary where the pronouns are in the embedded clause. Number 2 and number 3 are the bad ones. Number 2 is bad where the plain pronoun is in the subject position, C commanding the logophoric pronoun somewhere else. 3 is also bad where the logophoric pronoun is in the subject position, C commanding the plain pronoun somewhere else. The ones that are relatively acceptable are the first one and the fourth one. And where these are possible is where the first pronoun is not the subject, but it's embedded in the subject. It's not the object, but it's embedded in the object. When that happens, then the 2 pronouns are relatively okay. So the logophoric pronouns seem to be sensitive to the same kind of distinctions that each other is in English, definable in terms of C command. Now that was the BBO pattern that I just showed you. This kind of data has been collected in 3 other languages anyway, Abe, Edo, and Yoruba. And the fascinating, maddening thing is that the condition is different in every language. I won't go through all the variations just to confuse you. I'll go through them in the context of my analysis. But in Abe, the mixed pronouns are never good. In Edo, mixed pronouns are rarely good, but in one C command case, they are. In Yoruba, mixed pronouns are usually good, but there's one C command case where they aren't. And a BBO is kind of halfway in between there. Okay, thanks. Acknowledge the time. So that's a kind of a chaotic pattern. First reaction is that it's kind of a chaotic pattern. But now I'll try to show you the order before I even showed you the chaos. I didn't go through the chaos in detail because going through chaos is frustrating. It's all too easy to confuse people, and that's not my main purpose here. In fact, what I'm interested in here is there's an important universal here, I think. There is a universal factor that you might not notice at first in the chaos, plus 1 or 2 parametric choices. So we have an interplay between the universal and the variant, which is what I find so fascinating about typology. I'll talk about the universal part first. When the plain pronoun C commands the logophore, that's bad in every language. Where the logophore C commands the pronoun, that can vary. When neither of them C commands the other, that one can vary. But when the plain pronoun is the higher one in the structure than the logophore, that's bad in all. Here's the sorted out, organized data to show you. This is my BBO example from before. Ocon thinks that he insulted mother logophore, plain pronoun, C commanding logophoric pronoun, bad with the meaning that the 2 pronouns co-refer. Same in Yoruba. Olu wants that he find log's money, bad with he and log both meaning Olu. Edo exactly the same. Abe the same. It looks a little bit different. I don't have the matrix clause there. So here's a part that's uniform. Here's a part where all the languages agree. Might not have noticed it in the first description. Well, so we ask, why is it universally bad for a pronoun to C command a logophore? And my claim is not just that this is a point of uniformity, but it's a meaningful point of uniformity. This is something that taps into something deep about human natural language and how the building blocks that it's made up out of. There's going to be two parts to my claim. First part is that logophores, what logophores intrinsically are. They're really bound variables of a sort that I will explain. And second of all, there's deep principles about grammar about how true pronouns relate to bound variables. This is the so-called strong crossover effect that some of you probably know about, others may not. So this is why there is no variation there. My first step is to show that logophores are intrinsically bound variables, whereas pronouns must genuinely refer. So a bound variable, this is the sort of thing that a logician might use when they're doing first order logic. For all x, x is mortal, say. So we take the same kind of sentences. All the sentences I gave you before had a referring name in the matrix subject position. Here's similar, but we put a quantified expression that can't refer in the subject position instead. Instead of Ocon thinks that, or MM thinks that Ocon hates him, we have nobody thinks that Ocon hates him. For emo, that's no problem at all. Nobody thinks that Ocon hates him. This can go back to this. Now that can't be a referring expression there because this doesn't refer to anybody. What it can be is a semantic bound variable. For no x, x thinks that Ocon hates x. The logophore is fine as the bound variable, but the plain pronoun is degraded as the bound variable. And when the plain pronoun is used with a logophoric there, it's totally impossible with the bound variable. So it's difficult for a plain pronoun to refer to pick up as its antecedent this negative quantified thing. Whereas for the logophoric pronoun, it's totally natural. Claim is that this is putting unveiling a subtle difference in what these so-called pronouns really are. This is a bound variable. This is a referring expression. And using a quantified antecedent brings that out. Here's another way of bringing out that distinction in the business. I think I won't talk this one through in quite as much detail, but you use elliptical sentences. Ocon said that he will come to the party, and MM did too. Well, he here could be the logophoric version, or it could be the pronominal version. Since the subject here is a referring noun phrase, this is not possible. But it has a different kind of meaning. The question is, how do you understand the elided clause here? If you say, Ocon said that logophore will come to the party and MM did too. What's MM saying? MM's saying that he himself will come to the party. MM's doing the following. MM's saying for X, MM's saying that X will go to the party. So this is understood as a variable. It can mean Ocon in the first sentence, but it can mean MM in the second sentence. However, this one's a referring expression, meaning it has to refer to the same thing in both the first sentence and the elided sentence. So in this use, it means Ocon and MM are both talking about some other person that they will come to the party. Subtle semantic difference between the logophoric pronoun and the plain pronoun brought out in these special semantic environments. So what? That's claiming that there's a subtle difference in what logophoric pronouns and plain pronouns really are. Then the step two is something that we know from the literature, that ordinary pronouns can be variables, semantic variables sometimes, but subject to a C command condition. They cannot be derived variables if the intrinsic variable is C commanded by them. This will go by quickly for people who don't know this background, but I hope you'll get flavor for it. And so everyone loves mother. That can mean for all X, X loves his mother. And furthermore, in this situation, his can be a derived variable based on the intrinsic variable here from where the quantifier came. But you can't give that same kind of interpretation to he loves everyone mother. Here's a quantifier too. It can mean for all x, someone loves x's mother, but he here can't be replaced by a variable matching that variable because this one C commands that one. That's the strong crossover condition. We say the same thing with questions, because questions are a kind of quantifier. Who bought a picture of himself? For which x did x buy a picture of someone? Well, here the pronoun can be a derived variable dependent on that first variable. That's possible. But who did he buy a picture of? This one's bad. It's a possible sentence, but it can't mean for which x bought a picture of x. Can't mean the same thing that the first one meant. Why not? Here the pronoun, it has to be a derived variable, and it can't be dependent on the primary variable that its C commands. Well, I showed you that logophores are bound variables. What are they bound by? In the normal case, they're bound by that operator in the CP position that I told you about. The semantics of that is that this is a lambda expression, a lambda operator binding a variable. The logophoric variable is the intrinsic variable, just like the trace of the WH phrase is the intrinsic variable here. Then the question is, can the plain pronoun be a derived variable? And the answer is yes, if it's C commanded, no, if it's C commands. This pattern that we saw uniformly in all of the logophoric languages where there was no variation follows from logophore being an intrinsic variable, plain pronouns being pronominal, plus the crossover condition that we already know about from the study of quantifiers and interrogative constructions. Deep building blocks of language here. Shouldn't ever be variation here if the crossover condition is universal, if the semantic distinction between a bound variable and a referring pronoun is universal. That's half of my story about these kind of comparisons. What about the chaos? I didn't deny there was chaos. I just said it wasn't quite as broad chaos, as I said. So what about the variation that one finds in other kinds of configurations? Well, here, strong crossover condition and the variable pronoun distinction is silent about this. But other kind of morphological conditions could come in. Here's where the parameters could live. Here's where the variation could be tolerated. I think there's 2 points of variation, but I'm doing okay on time, actually, but I'm not sure I'm doing okay on complexity. I can't really see on Zoom here whether you're smiling and nodding and looking energized or whether you've fallen asleep. Well, I can tell for 4 of you, but that's not a very good sample. Here's a case of the variation. Suppose now the logophoric pronoun is put in the embedded subject position, and the plain pronoun is put down there somewhere like possessor of the object of the object. So same general issue of a logophoric pronoun and a plain pronoun in the same embedded clause trying to refer to the matrix subject. Well, this is strikingly variant across the languages. This is perfectly fine in Edo and Yoruba, but it's totally out in Abe and Ibibio. Why is there this kind of variation here? Well, here I have a less interesting, profound answer, but hopefully one that does the job. My hypothesis is this just has to do with the fact that pronouns should match their antecedents and grammatical features. So skip down to this sentence. You know, some languages like English and I guess Russian have gender on their pronouns. And if you want to say John thinks he saw his mother, if you want all the pronouns to refer to John, they should match in gender. You can't use her instead of he, which doesn't match in gender, and still have them refer to the same thing. There's just this very familiar statement from traditional grammar that pronouns should match their antecedents and grammatical features. Well, here's maybe the idea. What about logophoricity? I assume logophoricity is a semantic property, bound variable versus referring. Does that get grammaticalized as a grammatical feature in the language? Claim will be that some languages do that and some languages don't. In some languages, the logophore is a morphosyntactic feature as well as a semantic feature. In other languages, it isn't. So if the logophoric feature is a syntactic feature, then these two will mismatch and the example will be bad. That will be the abibio-abe situation. In other languages, there's still the logophore pronoun distinction, but it's not a morphosyntactic feature. So this won't be here in the syntax per se. And there the coreference will be good. It's not a deep explanation, but the point is that languages have a morphosyntactic skin as well as deep blood and bones, and there can be variation on the skin. Here there is. I have a little supporting evidence of this that for abibio, which is that abibio is a language with rich subject agreement. And it turns out that the logophoric pronoun and the plain pronoun trigger different agreement on the embedded verb. So the agreement triggered by emo is e, but the agreement triggered by anye is ah. So clearly there's a morphosyntactic difference here because the agreement picks that up. And the claim is the same agreement that's agreement's picking up here also determines what the pronouns have to look like. Unfortunately, I can't typologize this because the other languages don't have subject agreement. So therefore, we don't get the same kind of confirming evidence from agreement that you get in abibio. Here, I'll just skip a section in the interests of time and energy. This is the other point of variation. What happens when C commands yep, acknowledge the time, thanks. What happens when the two pronouns don't C command each other at all? There again, two of the languages allow coreference there, two of them don't. It's a different two, it's a different pair. This is an independent factor. You actually see the difference here, even not with two pronouns. The same factor you see even if you just have a plain pronoun in the embedded clause with no logophoric pronoun. So you try to have the plain pronoun refer to the matrix subject. I've shown you that that's okay in abibio throughout. It's also okay in Yorba, but it's not okay in Edo and Abe. So here the claim would be this is just hopefully another feature matching issue. The question is just, can the plain pronoun be bound by this logophoric operator? Some languages yes, some languages no. My not very interesting proposal is in some of these languages, the operator bears the morphosyntactic feature plus logophoric. That constrains the form of the pronoun. In others, it doesn't. So in one case, the question, one point of variation is, does the pronoun have the feature plus log or not? The other is, does the operator have the feature plus log or not? And that gives you enough parametric options to be able to get all of the patterns there. So here's my summary about this whole part of my talk. This is the local comparison among the West African parts. What I find interesting here is the behavior of the logophoric pronouns as a mix of factors. There are some universals that get into the deep nature of the building blocks of language, like the variable reference distinction, plus the crossover phenomenon. There we don't find the variation. There's other variable features that have to do with the morphosyntactic surface, like does logophoric count as a kind of grammatical feature or not. And both of these kind of factors are in general at work as we're trying to understand the complex patterns of cross-linguistic variation. All right, pause for breath, stretch for 10 seconds, get ready to do some broader scale comparison. This will be the last phase of my talk, where I show you can learn interesting things from comparing larger scale comparisons as well. So now I want to compare what we've learned about the logophoric languages with indexical shift in a variety of languages, especially the Magi language, which I've had the privilege of working on quite a bit. These examples I gave you before, remember the logophoric pronoun, it's kind of defined as a pronoun that can be used in embedded clauses, and it can refer to the matrix thematic subject, but not some other thing in the matrix clause. And I showed you that first-person pronouns in embedded clauses in Magi have that same character. This first-person pronoun can refer to the matrix subject of the speech verb, but it can't refer to the matrix object of the speech verb. In this simple sentence, they've been. And people have noticed this comparison before. Lots of people have said maybe shifted indexicals are really disguised logophoric pronouns, or vice versa. Others have tried to say this is really the same phenomenon with a little bit of a different look. And that's the kind of thing I'm going to be arguing for here too. Remember, this is my theoretical framework. There's the operator inside the comp position. The matrix thematic subject controls it. The operator binds the pronoun here. So the relationship between this and its ultimate antecedent is mediated by the pronoun. That's a fairly standard view for indexical shift. No, it's a fairly standard view for logophoric pronouns. It's not the standard view at all for indexical shift. So here's what I'm saying is a little edgy in the literature on indexical shift, and we can talk about that in the discussion if there are indexical shift experts here, which would be lovely. But I'm going to apply the same framework that I did to logophoric pronouns here, and I'm going to say basically the only difference is that this operator here is intrinsically first person in Magi, whereas it's third person in African languages. Therefore, if this is first person and binds that pronoun, it's expected that that pronoun is first person in Magi, but not in the African languages. And now most of what I'm going to do is show you how what I showed you for Ibibio and other African languages before, how that pretty much applies to Magi as well. So this will have two purposes. It will hopefully solidify the patterns that I told you about in the African languages and shows you that it goes further and more general cross-linguistically. My initial motivation for logophoric pronouns was to show you that pronouns behave differently below the complementizer than above the complementizer. Well, that's definitely true for indexical shift too. The first person pronoun inside the embedded clause, the finite embedded clause, can refer to the matrix subject. Santi told Banti that I saw Ram. I can mean Santi in this language, unlike English. But a first person pronoun that's not in an embedded clause cannot. So there's something worthwhile happening at the complementizer position. The other kind of evidence I showed you in the African languages is it depends on what the complementizer is, whether you get this effect or not. I can't show you that in Magi because Magi doesn't have very many complementizers. Basically has only the one for embedded clauses. But in some of the Turkic languages, especially the Eastern ones, I guess, you do have two different kinds of embedded complements. And in one type of embedded complements, a first person pronoun has to refer to the matrix subject. Emmett said that I left, meaning Emmett. In the other kind of complementation, an embedded subject can't be. So here it's not obvious that these are complementizers exactly because they're agglutinating languages and everything gets stuck on as a suffix, but I assume that's basically the same thing. that's a summary of my framework again. Remember, we've got these three relationships. When can you have the operator? What can control the operator? What conditions are there on the operator binding a pronoun down here? Those topics are point-by-point parallel to the analysis of logophoricity. And the results are 96% the same, in fact. Where can the operators occur? In what kind of phrases? I've already shown you data from full finite CPs with a verbal C. So when it's a finite verb phrase with however, in infinitives, this is impossible. So Santi told Banti to meet me. Here me has only its English meaning where it refers to the speaker. It can't say Santi told Banti to meet Santi, him, Santi. So in this kind of embedded clause, which is nominalized and the object of a preposition, the indexical shift isn't possible, just like the logophoric pronoun wasn't possible in the African language. Well, I say just like, I can't quite support just like. I said there were a few differences. If you actually compare an infinitival clause in the African languages to the infinitival clause in the Asian language, you do get a difference. The logophoric pronoun is possible in the infinitive. Okon instructed MN to respect him. He can be Okon, but not an indexical shift in Magi. So really what we have here is a kind of implicational universal, it seems like. You're most likely to have indexical shift and logophoric pronouns in full finite CPs. You're least likely to have it in fully nominalized sentences. And then languages can vary a bit on where the cutoff is, where the dividing line is. Well, that kind of situation is very familiar to topologists, of course. We have many phenomena that can be understood in those kind of terms. My second to last comparison, I'm giving you hope that this talk will end. My second to last comparison is what happens with the control of the operator. Before we looked at what could be the ultimate antecedent of the logophoric pronoun, now we're looking at what can be the ultimate antecedent of the shifted indexical. Before I claimed the answer was thematic subjects, with both thematic and subjects playing a role. Now we see exactly the same thing happening in indexical shift. So if you have Santi told Banti that I will come, I here can be the matrix agent subject. It cannot be the matrix theme goal recipient object. That's what we saw with logophoric pronouns too. But you might remember that I showed you that in logophoric languages, the verb here is different. Well, that's true in indexical shift languages too. Santi heard this I in the embedded clause is ambiguous as to what its antecedent is. It can be the hearer, or it can be the source. The claim is that a source is an agent-like thematic role. The goal is not an agent-like thematic role, and thematic roles are important for shifted indexicals in a way that's exactly parallel to how they were important for logophoric pronouns. So that's the thematic part of thematic subject. Here's the subject part of thematic subject. You might remember that I looked at remember versus remind in the African languages. When you say Ram remembered that I hid the money, the shifted I can be the person who remembers. But when you have a transitive version, Santi reminded Ram that I hid the money in the drawer. Now it changes. Now I can't refer to the rememberer, but only to the matrix subject, the one who's causing the remember. These are the same thematic role, but this one can be the antecedent of the shifted pronoun. This one can't be, rather this one has to be. That shows that subjecthood is important here too, in exactly the same way that it was in the Logophoric language. This part is the part I most
comparison of Magi and Abibio, and the
symbols are remarkable, I think, to me. I admit I'm praising myself there. All right, then the last point of this comparison is what restrictions are there on the operator binding the first person pronoun? Again, the first impression is that there are almost no restrictions. The shifted pronoun can be in any role: subject, object, possessor, object of preposition. It can be more deeply embedded. It can be inside a second embedded clause and still refer to the matrix subject. It can be inside a relative clause and still refer to the matrix subject, just like the logophoric pronouns could. The place in logophoric pronouns where we found some interesting restrictions were when you use two different pronouns in the same embedded clause trying to refer to the same matrix subject. When we look at this in indexical shift, the analogous question would be, with logophoric pronouns, would be whether a plain third person pronoun can be the same as a shifted first person pronoun or not. Before we asked, can a plain pronoun be the same as a logophoric pronoun? Now we're asking, can the same pronoun be the same as a first person pronoun? And you will be relieved to know that you don't need to know anything about C command. I needed to do the whole know about C command to do the whole paradigm, but the quick answer is no, this is never possible. First person pronoun and third person pronoun in the same domain can never have the same reference in Magi. Are we surprised about that? I claim I'm not surprised about that. Remember, we said that in African language like Abe, pronouns needed to match their antecedents in grammatical features, and logophoric was treated as a grammatical feature. In those languages, not in others. What about first person pronouns? First person pronouns are always treated like a grammatical feature, at least always in the languages that I've studied in these languages. Therefore, there's not going to be any variation here. If pronouns have to match antecedents and grammatical features, and the first-third distinction is always grammaticized, then indexical shift
that index.
But for predictable reasons. 96% the same, and where they're different, it's understandable because of this grammatical difference. Well, Anton has been very shy about giving me 2-minute warnings and 1-minute warnings and 0-minute warnings, but I will try not to abuse that too much. There's one other difference that's sort of interesting, I think. That's that you can have, apparently you can have two logophoric operators at the edge of a single clause, but you can only have one indexical shifting operator at the edge of a clause. I sort of think that might be because these are third person elements, and you can have more than one third person in a domain, but this is a first person element, and you can only have one first person in the domain. But I mostly skipped that. 2 minutes. Anton says, I think that's 2 extra minutes, but there you go. Closing remark about typology, there's a little distribution of indexical shift, and we're finding indexical shift in more and more languages. Notice that it's not in West Africa, but it is sprinkled more around the part of the world. That's the distribution of the logophoric pronouns. If I've succeeded in giving a unified analysis for the two, then instead of having a patchy distribution of indexical shift and a very patchy distribution of logophoric pronouns, we can add the two together and find something that's distributed across the world, something that you can say with a straight face that universal grammar applies to in a more serious way. And that's going to be even more true if I succeed in Korea in reducing the long-distance reflexives to the same kind of analysis. Here's my final conclusions. I said in my introduction that there was fractal comparison, meaning you find deep universals plus superficial variation at every level of granularity in investigation. I showed you two kinds, logophoricity within the West African languages. The universal part was crossover and the variable pronoun contrast. The variation came from the role of plus log in the feature system. Then I also showed you the grander comparison that logophoricity in Africa could be compared to indexical shift in a couple of Asian languages. There we saw the universal pattern where it came to control by a thematic subject, for example. But again, some variation coming from how first-person features behave as contrasted to logophoric features. Okay, thank you. That's what I came to say. Came in this euphemistic sense.
Thank you for the great talk, Mark. You successfully demonstrated that typologically rare and unusual features can be used for demonstrating universals and the deep and surface interplay. We have approximately 9 minutes for discussion. So questions, please.
Okay.
I don't see any raised hands. If my colleagues see them, please just feel free to raise a hand and ask a question.
And I understand you're not the world experts on logophoric pronouns, so that's fine.
I'm not sure. There are some experts in African languages who can just score them, but I don't know their position.
Yep.
Okay, just to, I think it's my turn to ask a silly question. And I don't imply that anybody has done this during the first conference day. So the question is whether languages with logophors and indexical shift can contribute to solving one of the logical and semantic problems like paradoxical sentences. Okay, something like I claim there is rain, but I don't believe in that, or say all who ask questions are liars. So a sentence like nobody claims that he doesn't claim anything. Can it be well formed in a language with anaphors?
I'm not going to know the answer, but I might be able to find out the answer. Could you repeat the sentence again, please? Nobody claims that. Oh, you muted yourself, Anton. Anton, could you unmute yourself and repeat the sentence?
Anton звук.
Suddenly I found myself to be muted. Nobody claims that he doesn't claim anything. Can it be grammatical in a language with indexical shift or with a logophore?
And not only grammatical, but with a coherent interpretation? Is that?
Well, I see hands from Mikhail Knyazev, sorry, Irina Burukina. Irina Burukina first, then Misha Knyazев, then Vadim Dichkov. So.
Yep.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the talk. It was like very interesting. And I have this minor question about, of course, how to reconcile those operators that you introduced with the, again, like those discus operators introduced, for example, in Landau's logophoric control analysis, right? So for instance, and I'm sorry for talking about Mari right now, but that's the only language that I know basically. So in Mari, for example, we do have indexical shift, in fact, in some situations, right? So apparently in some embedded clauses, we may want to postulate those indexical shift operators, right? We also have logophoric control. So in embedded non-finite clauses in logophoric control, we have discus operators, right? Which are bound by either the matrix speaker or the matrix at receive, for example, yep. Right? Either the matrix subject or the matrix object. But then we don't have apparently indexical shift in embedded infinitives. And isn't it there is some sort of discrepancy here, or are there, or are those operators like completely different operators, and you yep. may have like one or the other and whatever yep. randomly?
Yep. This is a phase of my research that I haven't gotten to yet as a part of a long-term project. Lots of people have talked about Pro having logophoric properties, but it does seem like that's true, but it's independent of both indexical shift and logophoricity. So what I think we want ultimately is a partially unified analysis to say that there are operators that are involved in control. There are operators involved in the phenomenon that I talk about. They're different operators, so they can function independently, but they do fall under some of the same principles. So a partially unified kind of analysis. That seems to be what we need to go. And I think it's going to be a little bit of a problem. There are people who have, like in the semantics literature on Desai and so on, there are people who have pretty aggressively assimilated this theory of Pro to logophoric phenomena as they've understood it. And I think some of that literature's got to go too far because the phenomena can coexist and be partially independent in my languages as well as your languages.
Okay, so in that particular case, for example, do I understand this correctly that, let's say, in some languages, on the left periphery of an embedded clause, we would have to have like several operators in a row, basically. Yes. So one of them is going to be logophoric operator, then there will be indexical shift operator. They will all be bound, for example, by the same matrix, let's say subject, but they will be different operators controlling different pronouns, right?
Well, sometimes sometimes they will be bound by the same matrix subject, sometimes they won't. So actually, I haven't found any language that has both logophoric and indexical shift operators. Those might really be two versions of the same thing such that they can't co-occur. Both of them can co-occur with control. The best place to see that in a BBO, though, is object control constructions. So I had an example in my PowerPoint about A instructed B to help log. And yes. There the pronoun is, the pro is controlled by one thing and the logophore is controlled by the other thing. And in fact, that one's bad if you try to make them both controlled by the same thing.
Dear colleagues, we have at least three questions more. The first is from Mikhail Knyazhev.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. So my question is about morphological makeup of logophores. Can you hear me? So in the beginning, you mentioned that some logophores can function as some kind of focused pronouns, and I'm not an expert on logophores, but I know that in some languages, in some African languages, they have the same form as demonstrative pronouns, but still in some other languages, they're really a special morphological form. And I'm wondering, because you mentioned a few things about morphological features of logophores being very important for those co-occurrence patterns with mixed pronouns. So I'm wondering whether your theory whether you make any predictions about the difference between those specialized logophores and those logophores that are third-person pronouns with respect to these mixed pronoun patterns.
Yep. Good. The answer is so far no. Maybe I should as I continue to deepen this work. I will say that of the 4 languages that I was primarily comparing there, the logophoric pronouns don't have the same etymology at all, or there might be a story for each one of them about the logophoric pronoun, but it seems like it's a different story. So that makes me less tempted to try to deduce important things from the finer structure of the pronoun. In Edo, that's the one where it can be the focus. In Edo, it seems like a familiar sort of strong versus weak pronoun distinction. What I called the plain pronoun is like a weak clitic form, whereas the focus pronoun is like a full bisyllabic independent prosodic word. And I'm sure that's relevant to the fact that one can be focused and the other can't. But that's not the situation in a BBO at all. In a BBO, they're both full prosodic words. There, it seems like one of them is omo and one of them is emo, but there you think there might be a morphological breakdown, but then the other form of it is anye, which doesn't fit either of those things. So yes, there's more to say about the sort of morphology, even morphophonology about these things in some cases, but I'm not aware yet of it correlating with anything about what I was talking about.
Thank you. Next question, Vadim Dichkov.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. Well, I'm working on West African languages, and my question is probably silly, but anyway, well, does the model you have presented say anything about logophoric pronouns and reflexives if they can be found within the same language? Sometimes they compete. Logophoric can buy logophores, logophores can buy reflexives. Does the model say anything about that?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything too interesting about that in the languages that I work on. So it's some systematic data has been collected by my colleague Ken Sapphire in his AFRNAF project. So in these cases, the languages have logophores, the languages have reflexive pronouns. They're quite distinct, unlike, say, Korean, the Japanese Korean data that I showed you, where a reflexive has logophoric uses. That's not the situation here. But you do see a reflexive in something like Ocon said that he embarrassed himself.
Yes.
There you will have Ocon said that logophore embarrassed logophore self. There will be a reflexive version of the pronoun, like his body, basically. And it will be in that context, it will be logophore's body as the himself. So what I take from that is that there is a reflexive, non-reflexive distinction, and that is independent of the logophore, non-logophore distinction, but then they can co-occur. There is such a thing as a logophoric reflexive. And that's what you have to use in that kind of sentence that I just quoted.
Many thanks. Next question, Dmitry Gerasimov.
Thank you very much for your lecture. There's a great deal of variation between known and lexical shift languages. And in many of them, the shift goes beyond pronouns. It's also observed with various locative and temporal expressions. Do you think that such cases pose some problems for your analysis, which is centered on control and binding?
Maybe. So it's true, and Magi was the indexical shift that I looked at. And there, first-person pronouns shift, second-person pronouns shift. And there's also shifted honorificity marking. I had a student who just, if you're using honorific forms of pronouns, is it the speaker who's honoring people, or is it the subject of the speech verb that's honoring people? And that shifts systematically too. We studied that in some detail. In that language, you can have some shifting of temporal and locative expressions. We haven't studied it so much. It doesn't seem to be directly correlated with the shifting of the indexical pronouns that we looked. It happens, it's a similar phenomenon, but it's not directly related as far as we can tell. I asked my student, does it make sense to say that there's a location operator at the periphery, and that binds a location pronoun inside? It's not, we don't have such good models for that. On the other hand, it's not an obvious non-starter to me. It's not a hypothesis that couldn't be considered.
Sure.
And we haven't really even started on that yet.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Many thanks. I think that we have no questions more, but probably as a follow-up, I would like to ask Mark whether a situation where a native speaker can select either a logophore or a usual pronoun contributes to semantics or to syntax. So if you can use a logophore but cannot use another type of pronominal expression, and vice versa,
Yeah.
What is it? Intrinsic semantic or tree structural constraints on variation, or just variation itself, morphosyntax?
Yep. I can say a little bit about that. I'm no expert on semantics and not on the semantics of pronouns in per se. I already told you almost everything I know about that. But to me, this is an interesting place where we really are kind of at the interface. There's a semantic component to it, and there's a syntactic component to it, and they're in a kind of a productive, non-accidental relationship. So what I meant by that is I think that semantically the logophores are bound variables. The pronouns are referring expressions. In some contexts, that doesn't seem to make any difference at all with like a ordinary referential antecedent. In other contexts, it does when you use a quantifier or when you use, you're interpreting the ellipsis or so on. All of that so far is semantic, I guess, if one's, labeling things. But on the other hand, then there's the fact that we know of the crossover phenomena, that there is syntactic conditions on when a pronoun can relate to a bound variable, and those point in too. So I would say it's a little too simple to say, and I guess in this case I'm assuming both of them are universal. I don't fully know that, but I'm assuming that the bound variable referring expression semantic part is universal. That seems clear, and probably lots of people would agree with that. But probably the syntactic part, the crossover condition, is also universal as far as I know. So yeah, there's no simple formula here of saying like the semantic part is universal, but the syntax part isn't. That seems too simple to me.
Many thanks. We have to thank Mark Baker for his exciting talk and for his patience. And I think it's time to close this session and the sessions of the first conference day. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your attention. Enjoyed doing this with you.